What was the Nakba, the Palestinian Nakba, about which I'm sure you've heard a lot? What really happened? And is there a difference between the historical truth and the way the story is usually told? In this video, I'm going to answer those questions. I'm Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. YouTube is full of Nakba explainers, I've discovered, and more often than not, what they are is intellectually lazy and quite often constitute a form of historical revisionism. I don't like historical revisionism. To be clear, the basic facts associated with the Nakba are well established and beyond dispute. So let's go over those facts. They are: 1. There was a war in 1947-1948 between Jews and Arabs in what was the British Mandate of Palestine. 2. The Arabs lost the war. 3. In the course of the war, the Jewish side destroyed many Arab communities and massacred a few. This is true. 4. Also in the course of the war, the Jewish side forcibly expelled some Arabs. This also is true. 5. As a result of the war, the Jews managed to capture most of what had been the British Mandate of Palestine. 6. As a result of the war, 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were displaced and found themselves refugees. Most of the 700,000, by the way, had not been forcibly expelled, i.e. at gunpoint, but rather they left on their own volition to get out of harm's way, which frankly is normal in this kind of conflict. They left expecting to be able to return to their homes after a quick Arab victory, which never happened. Now, these facts, as I said, are beyond dispute. At issue are not the facts. I'm not here to challenge them, but rather the narrative that has emerged around the word Nakba, the way the story is told. I find that the way the story is told tends more often to obscure rather than to inform. Indeed, one of the striking things about the word Nakba in the narrative is that often the word seems to mean different things at different times. Sometimes the word refers to the war itself and to the defeat. The very first time, in fact, that the word is used in this context of Arab-Israeli conflicts was in 1948, soon after the war, when a Syrian historian used the word to refer to the humiliation felt by the defeat of Arab armies. The way he described it is that 7 Arab armies invaded Palestine to destroy Zionism. They failed. Not only did they fail to grab the land that had been allocated by the UN to Jews, they also had failed to hold on to the land that the UN had allocated to Arabs. That was the Nakba, the war, the defeat, the humiliation felt because of this defeat. But sometime afterward, the word took on a different meaning and the focus started to shift towards the suffering, not the war or the defeat, but rather to the suffering that resulted from the war and the defeat, i.e. the plight of the 700,000. So let's look at what the UN says about the Nakba on its Nakba page. And of course the UN has a Nakba page. It says, the Nakba refers to the mass displacement and dispossession of Palestinians during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Okay, now let's look at the Wikipedia page. Nakba was the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in mandatory Palestine during the 1948 Palestine War through their violent displacement and dispossession of land, property, and belongings, along with the destruction of the society, culture, identity, political rights, and national aspirations. Bit of an exaggeration, but fine. If one focuses on the effect but pushes the cause out of the frame, the picture becomes very black and white and very, very one-sided. In this picture, what happens is that now the Arabs, the Palestinians, appear to be passive, innocent victims of Israeli aggression. They have no agency. They have no share in the responsibility for the calamity that befell them. There's no need to take account of the calamitous decisions made by Arab and Palestinian leaders. There's no need to think about the mistakes that they made, the many mistakes that they made. Thus, there's really nothing to learn here other than the fact that Palestinians are victims. That's it. That's the picture that we have now. And that's the story that the word Nakba often communicates. Now, already we can see why this is problematic and at the very least intellectually lazy or even dishonest. There are historical examples of entirely one-sided wars in which one country, out of sheer belligerence, attacks another country that is perfectly innocent and did absolutely nothing to incur to prompt this act of aggression. The German invasion of Poland in 1939, I think, is a very clear example. I also think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is another example. The Ukrainians were just living their lives, doing their thing, when at some point Vladimir Putin decided that the existence of Ukraine was intolerable, so he set about destroying it. The 1947-1948 war was, in contrast, not that kind of war, that kind of one-sided fight. There were two sides with conflicting agendas, two sides that had been at each other's throats for decades, two sides that had been committing acts of violence against one another, two sides with blood on their hands, two sides with agency. So let's talk about the war more closely. We need to focus on the war. Now, for full disclosure, my preferred source on the 1948 war is the Israeli historian Benny Morris, who wrote this marvelous book, 1948. This is a really great book, and if you want to buy it, which I highly recommend it, I put a link in the description below. Plus, if you buy the book through the link, it's a great way to support this channel. The historiography of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and certainly the 1948 war, is dominated by polemics on either side. And it might be impossible to find any one book that is truly objective and truly balanced. But I think that this book comes closest, and that this is really the best research and the most balanced that I've been able to find. According to Morris, the war had two phases. The first phase was basically a civil war between the Jewish and Arab residents of the British Mandate of Palestine. The second phase began in May 1948 when Israel declared its independence and the surrounding Arab countries invaded. The trigger of the first phase was the UN resolution voted for by the UN in November 1947 to partition the British Mandate into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The map I'm showing you here, the sort of bluish-greenish, is the Jewish side. The Jewish side rejoiced. There was literally dancing in the streets, and Jewish Zionist leaders embraced the UN vote as basically great. We'll take what we can get. This is really wonderful. We can work with this. The Arab side, chief among them, the Palestinian leader al-Husseini, categorically rejected the UN partition. Keep in mind, they didn't quibble with the line being this way, or with a community falling under one jurisdiction or another. Rather, they categorically objected to the entire idea, the whole project. They thought it was intolerable that Jews should receive any autonomy over any part of this land. So rather than accept the deal and get half or try to renegotiate it, they rejected the entire thing, 100%, and they gambled on war. The UN vote be damned. What were the different war aims? For the Jewish side, it was above all survival, followed by the project of creating what the Zionists had for decades called the Jewish home, which at some point eventually evolved into the project of trying to carve out some sort of sovereign Jewish state. What did they want the boundaries to be? What did they intend for the Arabs who lived within those boundaries? Now, Zionists as a group historically are and have been extremely diverse. One can find everybody from far-left Zionists to far-right Zionists, or perhaps from your perspective, I should say, far-left Zionists and far-right Zionists. You could find rabidly anti-religious Zionists and rabidly religious Zionists. You could find secular humanist universalist Zionists, and you can also find Zionists who are outright racists, admittedly. Thus, if you look hard enough, you can find Zionists saying just about anything with respect to the Arabs or respect to where the borders of the country should be. But what matters is the consensus. What matters are the decisions made by the leadership of the Zionist nationalist project. And the consensus was almost always in favor of realism, i.e. you take what you can get. And also there was no intent to expel the Arab population. All of the major Zionist leaders that I've read acknowledged that there would be a large Arab minority in this country, wherever the country's boundaries would end up being, for no other reason than expelling them was impossible. And they also presumed that it wasn't necessary, that this is fine. So even Zeb Jabotinsky, who is this right-wing Zionist theorist, some people call him a fascist, who was, by the way, the spiritual father of the Likud party, which is the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, even he said that there would be a large Arab minority in this country, and that was fine. This is not a problem. Now, as a result, because this is never the purpose, there were no general orders saying massacre everybody or expel everybody. When these things did happen, and there are cases, as I've said, when commanders would massacre people or they expelled people from certain communities, it was done usually by the work of local leaders at a certain moment and a certain place. This was not the general policy. These were not the general orders. What the Jewish leadership did do, and this is on record, and Benny Morris documents this, is they did say, once the Arabs are gone, for whatever reason they're gone, don't let them back in, right? So the decision to expel them was not official policy. What was official policy was not to let them back in, those who had been expelled or had left or had fled or whatever. Also, please remember that most of the Arab communities were not troubled, and today 20% of Israeli citizens are Arabs. Now, from the Arab side, the objective, the war aim, was to snuff out the Jewish nationalist project and to get rid of all the Jews. Arab leaders did make exceptions. They did say, according to Morris, that they would let live in this future Arab state those Jews who had been there since before Zionism. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, according to Morris, some people, some of the time, would say 1917, which is the date of the Balfour Declaration. Other times, the date that they would pick would be 1881, which is an important landmark in the history of the modern Zionist settlement in Palestine. Either way, what they're talking about is getting rid of most of the Jews who happened to live in the British Mandate in 1947. The Jews would somehow go away. When the war began, Jewish paramilitaries began on the defensive, fighting to defend Jewish communities and also fighting to secure lines of communication, roads, right? Because roads often were attacked and communities got cut off and were besieged. So there were wars over the roads. They fought tooth and nail. Now, remember, this war started November 1947, which is only a little more than 2 years after the end of World War II, a little more than 2 years after the end of the Holocaust. A lot of these fighters themselves were Holocaust survivors. And from their point of view, there was really no doubt about what was going on. They were facing another genocide, and they were going to do anything they could to prevent that. The fighting was nasty and brutal. These were irregular forces going after one another and going after each other's communities. At some point, the Jewish side got strong enough to start going on the offensive. According to Morris, first they tried to secure those bits of land that had been allocated to Jews by the United Nations vote. And then at some point they started moving beyond that and going beyond those boundaries and grabbing parts of the land that had been allocated to Arabs by the UN partition. The second phase of the war was kicked off the day after Israel declared its independence. This was in May of 1948. At that point, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt invaded, along with contingents from other countries, the largest being Iraqi. Their war aim was the same as before. It was to snuff out this Jewish nationalist project and get rid of the Jews. Jordan, by the way, was an exception. King Abdullah, according to Morris and lots of other sources that I read, said that he had no interest in helping the Palestinians or creating any kind of Palestinian state or anything like that. Rather, he wanted to grab some of this land so that he could add it to his nascent kingdom. Because he had limited war aims, this meant that he was de facto a moderate. And there's a long and well-documented history of communications between Abdullah and Zionist leaders where they were feeling each other out. And it's very clear that both sides had goodwill towards the other, and both sides believed that they could work out some sort of accommodation with the other, some sort of modus vivendi. It didn't really do him any good because Abdullah was assassinated in 1951, reportedly by a Palestinian who had heard a rumor that Abdullah was cooking up a peace treaty with Israel. Jewish aims during this stage of the war were likewise the same that they had been during the first phase, the survival above all, because again they thought that these armies were going to kill them all, so they felt like they faced genocide. And then after they sort of absorbed the invasion, right, they survived, then they went on the offensive again and they were able to grab still more land. Why were the Arabs losing? According to Morris, and again, everything else I've read, the Arab armies were simply in no shape to wage a war, let alone an expeditionary war. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped, poorly motivated. They didn't coordinate amongst themselves. The Arab countries didn't coordinate amongst themselves. Often they had slightly different agendas, which put them at odds with one another, and they're suspicious of one another, etc., etc. Whereas on the Jewish side, they were highly motivated. Remember, they're fighting for their lives. They were better prepared, better trained, and eventually they became better equipped. Plus, they benefited from unity of command, internal lines of communication, etc. So either way, the Jewish side, though badly outnumbered, outclassed the Arab side and was able to defeat them. When the war ended, the Israelis had succeeded in expelling most of the Arab armies and in grabbing most of the land that had been the British mandate. The one Arab army that they did not expel was the Jordanian army, which had grabbed the West Bank and grabbed East Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, the Israeli leadership was okay with this. They thought this was fine. And they focused instead on expelling the Egyptians because the Egyptians posed a more immediate threat to Tel Aviv, and also the Egyptians, because of where they were located, cut off a lot of the Jewish communities that were in the Negev desert. The Jewish willingness the Israeli willingness to let Jordan maintain control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, I think says a lot about their pragmatism and their realism. The West Bank and Jerusalem contain the most holy sites in Jerusalem. The West Bank is the cradle of Judaism and the cradle of the Jewish people. Remember, Jews are Judeans, and Judea is the southern half of the West Bank. So surely Zionists, even the non-religious ones, desired the West Bank and desired Jerusalem and thought that this would be great. It would be great if they could grab these Jewish holy sites. But ultimately, they thought that this situation was preferable, meaning it's occupied by Jordan. Jordan, they trusted that the Jordanians weren't out to destroy them. So this is a situation that they could live with. And this went on until 1967 when the situation changed, but that's a topic for another video. Over the course of the war, according to Morris, the Jewish side killed 800 civilians and prisoners. He explains that the prisoners thing was something that both sides did. Neither side during the first phase of the war took prisoners. That came to an end with the second phase of the war, when the war now changes from basically irregular paramilitaries going after one another to regular armies fighting one another. It's at that point where they built, both sides, proper POW camps and applied the Geneva Convention, etc. But the reality is that the Jewish side killed a lot of civilians. Morris, by the way, disputes only one of the alleged massacres on the grounds that those who were alleging that a specific massacre had taken place at a specific place and time were not credible, and also there was contradictory information suggesting that there had been no massacre. But all the other well-known alleged massacres, like Deir Yassin, Morris says, yeah, this happened, and it's true, and he explains in detail exactly what happened. It's not pretty reading. All in all, according to Morris, the Jewish side killed more Arab civilians than the Arab side killed Jewish civilians. However, Morris insists that this was not the result of better behavior or more benign intent. On the contrary, it was a result of a lack of opportunity. Arabs had fewer opportunities to kill Jewish civilians once the Jewish side went on the offensive. From then on, it was mostly the Jewish side, the Zionists and the Israelis, overrunning Arab communities rather than Arabs overrunning Jewish communities. Now, those Jewish communities that the Arab side did overrun, they destroyed. They expelled the residents, and in at least one example, they massacred them. I'm thinking of Gush Etzion. That was the work of the Jordanian army, which I believe was led by British officers. Interesting. The Egyptians destroyed several communities. Also, that same Jordanian army ethnically cleansed East Jerusalem. They kicked out the ancient Jewish community of the old city. They blew up all the synagogues, which had been there for centuries, and they barred access to Jewish holy sites to Jews. I do not believe it is a stretch to say that had the Arabs won the war, they would have, at best, expelled most, if not all, the Jews of Palestine, at worst committed what today would be defined as genocide. Why do I believe this? One, what in fact happened in those Jewish communities that got overrun. Two, what we know of Arab war aims, which was to get rid of the Jewish population. Three, the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic aspect of the war. This last point is very important. Many Arabs and their Western champions like to say that Arab resistance to Zionism has nothing to do with the fact that Zionists happen to be Jews. That, they say, is just an unfortunate coincidence because they don't have any problem with Jews. Rather, the problem with the Zionists is that they are, in their eyes, these outsiders, interlopers, whom they associate with Western imperialism, who are coming to steal their land. I think that's a lie. According to Morris, the rhetoric at the time of the war was very clearly anti-Jewish and very often just straight-up anti-Semitic. And the war was framed in terms of a jihad against the infidel, and was very clear about, no, these people aren't Muslims, these are Jews, right? Besides, Arab leaders, several Arab leaders, according to Morris, even before the war started, threatened to go after their own Jewish populations. Now think about this. If your problem with Zionists is that they are Western interlopers, fine. But why are you going to go after your own Jewish populations? What do they have to do with the conflict? Plus, your own Jewish populations had been in Arab countries for many, many centuries, and in some cases millennia. Why go after them? As it happened, they made good on their threat. Once the war started, there was this outburst of anti-Jewish violence all across the Arab world. There were massacres, pogroms, lynchings. There were all sorts of legal discrimination, legal forms of discrimination put in place. People were harried, they were dispossessed, etc., etc. The net result was that roughly the same number of Jews ended up fleeing Arab lands as the number of Palestinians who ended up fleeing Palestine and became refugees. Thus, and consequently, if you look all over the Arab world, you'll see that there are no more Jews, right? They're gone. Lebanon, gone. Sudan, gone. Egypt, gone. I don't know if there are any Jews in 1947 Jordan, but there sure aren't any now. Where am I? Syria, gone. Yemen, gone. Libya, gone. The only exception to this really is Morocco, because Morocco alone of all of the Arab states didn't actually go after Jews. In fact, the violence that did happen in Morocco, and there was violence, there were pogroms, but it happened despite the wishes of the Moroccan authorities and despite the wishes of the Moroccan crown. With all these Jews who fled Arab lands, you might think that there is talk of a Jewish refugee problem or crisis, but there really is none, and that never happened. Why? Well, because wherever the Jews went, and most of them did end up in Israel, where today they and their descendants constitute about half the population, they were given citizenship and integrated. Whereas the Palestinians who ended up in Arab lands, because of decisions made by Arab and Palestinian leaders, were never given that opportunity. There was rather a conspiracy on the part of Arab and Palestinian leaders to freeze Palestinians into permanent refugees. And that's a condition that exists even in Palestinian lands that are governed by Palestinians, like Gaza and parts of the West Bank. How are you a refugee when you're actually in your own country and you're in parts that are governed by your own people? I don't understand. But that's the choices that had been made to keep Palestinian refugees permanently refugees. The anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic nature of the war, I believe, goes a long way to explain the intensity of the humiliation felt by Arabs. It was bad enough to be beaten by people who are outsiders or people that you associate with Westerners. But the real problem, what really rubs people the wrong way, what really burns, is that they were beaten by Jews, of all people, Jews who really occupy one of the lowest rungs of the social order in the Islamic world. It's a class that could be described in terms of their abasement and their extraordinary poverty. And I think for many also, the abasement of the Jews, their wretchedness, was theological validation of the fact that they had picked the wrong religion and insisted on holding on to the wrong religion, whereas they, Muslims, or the same argument is made in the Christian world, the Christians had clearly chosen the correct religion. But this is really the source of the humiliation. This is why this burns so much. It's not that they're outsiders, it's that the people who beat them, who defeated them, were Jews of all people. Okay, so let's wrap this up. What was the Nakba? The Nakba was several things at once, all of which are true. First, in purely human terms, the Nakba is a story of large-scale human suffering. 700,000 people made refugees, plus some documented cases of murder. This is all terrible. Now, Morris does say that some of the expulsions had a cold-blooded military logic to them. So, for instance, in the fight over the lines of communication, over the roads, there were some Arab communities that were known to be the origin of the fighters, the irregulars who were regularly attacking the roads. So the Zionist militias would clear them out. Or Arab communities that were attacking Jewish communities, so the Jewish communities the Jewish paramilitaries would clear them out. Maybe. But there's no justification for the massacres, and Morris, to his credit, offers none. He's not about to do that. Rather, he documents them and says, this is true, this is what happened. There's no justification. But the Nakba is also other things. The Nakba it was a two-sided war with responsibility on both sides. Both sides had agency. Both sides could have made different decisions and done different things. And remember, there had been violence going back for decades preceding the war. And of course, during the war, both sides killed civilians, both sides destroyed communities. The Nakba was also, 3, a massive policy and political failure on the part of Arab and Palestinian leadership, who chose to go to war. They gambled in war and they lost, which made the Nakba, to a considerable extent, a self-inflicted catastrophe. Now, fundamentally, the biggest mistake made by the Arabs was this 100% maximalist and rejectionist policy. The no accommodation, no negotiation, which is why they ended up with nothing. Now, driving that rejectionism was their anti-Semitism, I believe, to a considerable extent. But what if that had not been a component of the conflict? What if they really were fighting Zionists who were, imagine they were Norwegians, right? They're fighting these Norwegian settlers, but they don't hate the Norwegians, or rather they hate them as interlopers, but you don't have that sort of intense animus. Maybe that would have yielded a more moderate, a more flexible political position. I mean, who knows? And what if Arab leaders had been more like King Abdullah, who had more limited war aims and thus was more amenable to conversation, at the very least? Likewise, what if they had simply chosen not to go to war because they took an honest assessment of their ability to fight a war and decided that they couldn't pull it off? We can't fight a war that we're going to lose, so let's not fight the war. Let's use other methods. Let's do something else. But they didn't. Lastly, the Nakba is an attempt at genocide against the Jews. I mean, at the very best, ethnic cleansing, but I think that genocide would be a fair word to use. Only it backfired, right? It's like throwing a boomerang only to have it fly back and crack your skull. Now, remember, the laws on genocide, which we're not all experts on because of the ICJ allegations, focus on intent. It's the intent that distinguishes genocide from simple mass murder or collateral damage. It's the intent. And I think that the intent was clearly there. It was clearly part of the war aims through both phases of the war. Casting the narrative such that it only focuses on that story of the human suffering, right? And the story's true. People suffered. This is real. But casting the narrative in those terms, I think, is intellectually dishonest. It focuses on the effect. It excludes the cause. It saves one from having to take into account any share of the responsibility that the Arab leadership had in causing this catastrophe, which does, of course, mean that there's nothing to learn here other than that Palestinians are victims, when I think that's hardly the case. Or if they're victims, they're at least as much victims of their own leadership as they are of the Zionist leadership. Or I suppose it's debatable, but either way, there's a lot of responsibility to go around, and there's a lot of blame to go around. But one thing that the Palestinian Arabs were absolutely not was that they were absolutely not passive, and they had agency. I also think that a more honest assessment would go a long way also in terms of the Israeli side. If you just present the one-sided argument, the one-sided, oh, woe is me, all these terrible things that happened, I sense that Israelis and Jews are too ready to roll their eyes and to just shrug it off and like, whatever, this is nonsense because we know the story to be different. So we're going to ignore you, which is a problem because the suffering is real. And I think that if one took an honest assessment of the suffering, then that ideally should foster empathy, and empathy should lead to understanding and a greater willingness to compromise. So both sides, I think, actually would benefit from having a more honest assessment. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Please like and subscribe. If you want to pick up Benny Morris's 1948, there's a link in the description. Please also subscribe to my Substack, Pax Americana. Again, link in the description. You could also check out my website, michaelshirkin.com, and find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye-bye.